Hi, I'm Yukino. Many collectors believe that a famous signature proves everything about a Japanese sword. When they see a well-known name carved into the temple, they feel a sense of certainty. It feels like history. It feels like authority, and it feels like proof. For many people, the signature becomes the center of attention. It becomes the reason they trust the sword, and for many collectors, that moment feels like clarity. They believe they have already found the most important answer, because the name seems to remove uncertainty. But that feeling can be misleading. But in reality, this belief is one of the most dangerous misunderstandings in the entire Japanese sword market, because a signature by itself does not guarantee anything. It does not guarantee authenticity. It does not guarantee quality. And it certainly does not guarantee value. This is where many collectors become overconfident. They stop questioning what they are looking at, and they begin to rely on the name instead of the evidence. But in this field, confidence without verification creates risk. In fact, there are many swords that carry impressive names, yet do not match those names at all. Some signatures were added decades after the sword was made. Others were added centuries later, and some were created with a clear intention to increase the perceived value of the blade. And over time, these added signatures become difficult to distinguish because they age. Together with the blade, they begin to look convincing, especially to those who rely only on the name. These are called gimei, false signatures, and this is not a rare exception. It is a pattern that has existed for hundreds of years. Whenever value concentrates around certain names, imitation follows. And the more valuable the name becomes, the more frequently it is imitated. Over time, this creates a situation where the name appears everywhere, but the genuine work remains rare. This is not unique to swords. It happens in art, it happens in antiques, and it happens in every collector market where names become valuable. During the Edo period, sword collecting became popular. Swords were no longer just weapons. They became objects of appreciation, objects of study, and eventually objects of status. As a result, certain swordsmith names became extremely desirable. Collectors began to seek specific names, and those names started to carry meaning. Beyond the blade itself, they became symbols. Symbols of taste, symbols of knowledge, symbols of status. And once those names became valuable, something inevitable happened. People began to reproduce them, not always with bad intentions. Sometimes as tribute, sometimes as imitation, and sometimes as deception. But regardless of intention, the result was the same. The connection between name and blade became unstable. And once that connection is no longer reliable, the entire way you evaluate a sword has to change. The name and the blade became disconnected. And this is where collecting becomes difficult. Because now, you cannot rely on the name alone. You need something else, something more reliable. Because without a reliable reference, you are left with assumptions. And assumptions do not hold value in the long term. Something that cannot be easily changed or add later. And that brings us to the most important question. If you cannot trust the signature, what should you trust instead? If you cannot trust the signature, then you have to trust something else. And in Japanese sword collecting, there is only one answer. You trust the blade itself. This idea may feel unfamiliar at first, because in many fields, names are the starting point. But here, the blade comes first, and the name comes later. Not the name, not the story, not the assumption, the blade. This may sound simple, but in practice, it is not simple at all, because a blade does not explain itself directly. It does not come with labels. It does not tell you who made it, or when it was made. You have to learn how to read it. And this is where many people struggle, because the blade does not give you answers directly. It only gives you clues. And those clues have to be interpreted. Experts begin with the overall shape. They look at the length, the curvature, and the proportions of the blade. They observe how the blade flows from the base to the tip. Is it powerful? Is it elegant? Is it balanced? These are not subjective impressions. They are structured observations. Each of these observations connects to something deeper. The shape reflects how the sword was intended to be used. The curvature reflects how it was drawn and swung, and the balance reflects how it performs in motion. Next, they examine the hamon, the hardened edge pattern. At first glance, the hamon may look like decoration, but it is not decoration. It is a record of the heat treatment process. It shows how the blade was hardened. And it reflects the technique of the swordsmith. It also reflects the level of control during the hardening process. Small variations can indicate differences in temperature, timing, and skill. These are subtle details, but they carry important information. Some hamon are straight and controlled. Others are irregular and full of movement. Some contain bright crystalline structures called ni. Others show a softer, mist-like structure called neoi. These differences matter because they point to specific traditions and specific methods of production. Over time, these patterns became associated with particular schools. So when experts see a certain type of hamon, they immediately begin to narrow down the possible origins of the blade. Even small details within the hamon can reveal important information. The density of the pattern, the consistency, the transitions. All of these elements help experts understand how the blade was made. And more importantly, whether the blade is consistent with a specific school or period. Even slight inconsistencies can raise questions. Because in a well-made blade, details tend to align. When they do not, it suggests that something does not fit. Then they examine the steel itself. the surface of the blade contains a visible structure known as hada. This structure is created during the forging process. It cannot be added later. It cannot be easily faked. It is part of the blade itself. This is why the steel is so important, because it carries the memory of the forging process, layer by layer. It records how the blade was constructed. But observation alone is not enough. Experts compared the blade to many known examples. They build a mental reference. This reference does not come quickly. It develops over time through repeated observation and comparison. And with each comparison, the patterns become clearer. Over years of study, they recognize patterns, and those patterns allow them to identify consistency or inconsistency. This is why experience matters, because the more swords you study, the more clearly you can see these patterns, and once you see them, you begin to understand something important. The blade cannot hide its origin. It may take time to recognize these patterns, but once you begin to see them, they become difficult to ignore. Once you begin to observe the blade, another layer of understanding appears. You start to notice that not all swords are made the same way. They are shaped by time, by place, and by purpose. And these differences are not random. They follow patterns. And once you begin to recognize these patterns, you realize something important. These differences are not random variations. They are structured results of time and context. For example, blades from the Kamakura period often show a deep curvature and a graceful, flowing shape. They were designed for mounted combat. Speed and cutting efficiency were essential. The shape was not chosen for appearance. It was shaped by function. Every curve served a purpose, and that purpose was survival. In contrast, many blades from the Edo period are more straight and controlled. They reflect a different time, a time when swords were not used as frequently in battle, but were still worn as symbols of status and identity. This shift in purpose changed how swords were made. Precision became more visible. Control became more important than raw effectiveness. And that change can still be seen in the blade today. These differences in shape are not just visual, they are historical evidence. They tell you when the sword was likely made, and they help narrow down its possible origin. Because when multiple elements point to the same period, the likelihood increases that the identification is correct. This is not guesswork. It is accumulation of consistent evidence. The same is true for the Heimin. Different schools developed different styles of hardened edged patterns. Some preferred simple, straight lines. Others created complex and dynamic patterns, full of movement. These differences did not appear by accident. They were developed over generations, passed down from teacher to student, refined over time. Even within those patterns, there are details that reveal deeper information. The brightness of the knee, the softness of the noyoi, the way the pattern transitions along the blade. These are not decorative choices. They are technical signatures in many ways. They function like fingerprints, not identical, but consistent enough to be recognized by trained eyes of how the sword was made. Workmanship also plays a role. How carefully the blade was forged, how consistent the structure is, how refined the overall execution appears. All of these elements combine to form a profile, and this profile is not based on one feature. It is based on the combination of many elements, each supporting the others. And that profile can be compared to known traditions: shape, hamon, steel, and workmanship. They begin to point in the same direction. When this happens, confidence increases, because the evidence is no longer isolated, it becomes connected, and that direction is often more reliable than any signature. Because unlike a signature, these characteristics cannot be easily added later. They are built into the blade itself. They are part of its creation, and that makes them far more difficult to fake. And this is why experienced collectors placed their trust in the blade first, because the blade carries the truth of its creation. Now that you understand how experts look at a blade, we can move to the next step. What actually happens in the real market? Because this is where many expectations begin to break, because theory and reality are not always the same. What seems obvious in explanation often becomes unclear in practice. At first glance, the logic seems simple. A sword with a famous signature should be more valuable than one without a signature. It feels natural. Name equals recognition. Recognition equals value. This way of thinking is not wrong. It works in many other markets, but in this case, it is incomplete. But in practice, this assumption often fails, because once collectors look beyond the name, they begin to see something else. They begin to see the blade itself, and once that shift happens, the name becomes less important. Not irrelevant, but secondary. Imagine two swords appearing in the market. One carries a well-known signature. The other has no signature at all. At this moment, the situation looks simple, but the decision is not simple, because both swords carry different kinds of information. Most beginners choose the signed sword because the name feels safe. It feels reliable. It gives them a sense of confidence, and that feeling is powerful because it reduces uncertainty. It gives the impression that the risk is lower. But experienced collectors do something different. They pause. They do not decide immediately. Instead, they examine the blade first. They delay judgment. They gather information, and they allow the blade to speak first. If the signed sword does not match the expected characteristics, its value drops very quickly, because the mismatch creates doubt, and doubt reduces trust. And once trust is reduced, value follows. Because in the market, value and trust are closely connected. On the other hand, if the unsigned sword shows strong and consistent workmanship, collectors recognize its quality immediately, even without a name. Because quality can be observed, it can be compared, and it can be confirmed through study. This is why some unsigned swords sell for higher prices than signed ones. Because collectors are not buying a name, they are buying what they can verify. Verification is what reduces risk, and reduced risk creates confidence, and confidence drives value. And this is where the market becomes clear. Value is not created by the signature. Value is revealed by the blade. This is the point where understanding translates into price. And this is why knowledge matters in this market. At this point, we can ask a practical question. If the signature is not enough, and the blade is what matters, how should you actually evaluate a sword? Where do you begin? Because without a clear process, it is easy to become overwhelmed. There are too many details, too many things to look at, and no clear starting point. The process is not complicated, but it requires discipline, because the most common mistake is not lack of knowledge, it is looking in the wrong order. Even correct knowledge can lead to wrong conclusions if it is applied in the wrong sequence. Order matters more than most people realize. So let's simplify it. You can start with 3 essential questions. These questions help you avoid the most common mistakes, and they guide your attention to what actually matters. Think of these questions as a filter. They help you remove noise and focus only on what is essential. First question: does the blade match a known tradition? When you look at the overall shape, the curvature, and the proportions, do they align with a specific period or school? If the blade does not align with any known tradition, that is a warning sign. Because authentic work tends to follow patterns. Second question: is the workmanship consistent? Does the head flow naturally along the blade? Do the details appear controlled and intentional? Or do they feel uneven and inconsistent? Consistency does not mean perfection. It means intention. It means that the details work together instead of conflicting with each other. Consistency is important because a well-made blade shows control, it shows intention, and it reflects the skill of the maker. Inconsistent details often indicate problems, and these problems may not always be obvious. They can be subtle, but when you look carefully, they begin to stand out. Third question: does the signature support the blade or contradict it? If the blade suggests one tradition, but the signature claims another, something is wrong. And this is one of the clearest signals that the signature should not be trusted, because the blade and the name are telling different stories. And this is where Many collectors fail. They trust the signature, even when the blade disagrees. But experienced collectors do the opposite. They trust the blade first. They resist the temptation to accept the easier answer, because the easier answer is often the wrong one. If you follow this order, blade first, signature second, you reduce risk. And you begin to see the market more clearly, because you are now reducing uncertainty. And in any market, reduced uncertainty leads to better decisions, because you are no longer guessing, you are observing, you are comparing, and eventually, you are deciding based on evidence. And once you reach this point, your perspective changes. You are no longer following the market. You begin to understand it. At this point, we can step back and look at the bigger picture, because what we have discussed is not only about signatures, it is about how value is created and how it is understood, because in the end, collecting is not only about objects, it is about interpretation. How you see something changes what it means. In many fields, people rely on names. Names create recognition. Recognition creates trust, and trust often leads to value. But in Japanese sword collecting, this relationship is not so simple. Names can guide attention. They can create expectations, but they can also create bias. And that bias can distort judgment, because a name can be added later. A name can be imitated. A name can even be completely false. But the blade itself cannot be changed so easily. It carries the history of its creation. It carries information that cannot be rewritten, not by engraving, not by polishing, and not by time. Every detail in the blade records something real. The hammer records the moment of heat. The steel records the forging process. The shape records the purpose for which it was made. Each element is part of a larger story, a story that exists inside the blade itself. And when you learn to read these details, you begin to see what others cannot see. You begin to understand why some swords are truly valuable, and why others only appear to be valuable. And this is where experience begins to matter, because recognition is built through repetition. This is what shapes the collector market. Not just information, but interpretation. Not just names, but understanding. Information can be shared, but understanding has to be built, and that difference is what creates long-term advantage. A signature may tell a story. It may suggest a connection to a famous swordsmith. But the steel tells the truth, and the truth is always found in the blade. And the more you study, understanding this difference is what separates beginners from real collectors. It changes how you see swords, and it changes how you make decisions. It is the point where collecting stops being guesswork and becomes understanding. And once you begin to see this clearly, you realize something important. Value is not something that is written, it is something that is revealed. And once you see that, you begin to trust your observations more than appearances. If you want to see how this framework looks in real listings, my shop is linked below. And that is where real collecting begins.